Okay, now for the second part of chapter 4. I think we'll probably do, I don't know, 3 or 4. Chapter 14. Probably do 3 or 4 of them. We'll see how it goes here. So now we're looking at competitive coexistence. So we talked about competition, how interaction, hurts somebody. It may have no impact on one species, or they both decline. Now we're looking at ways that competition can lead to coexistence. And so ecologists have long thought competition between species was important to communities. Darwin argued that it can influence both the ecological and evolutionary processes. Interspecific competition can lead to 2 possible outcomes. So competition between species. And those 2 things are competitive exclusion and competitive coexistence. So competitive exclusion is the dominant species prevents the other species from using these essential resources, and the inferior species will become locally extinct. So we can have a competition between 2 species. One's just a better competitor, drives the other one out of that area. Local extinction is the important key here. So if there's a habitat where, I'm trying to think of, there's 2 different mice, or no, well, like the ant and mouse example for seeds. If the ants are just way better at getting seeds, they could grab all the seeds and the mice would become locally extinct in that area. But in reality, most species show some sort of competitive coexistence, the ability to coexist despite sharing limited resources. And that can oscillate. Some species could be better adapted to drought. So during rain times, the other species will be more dominant. And during drought, the drought-tolerant species might become more dominant. But they're able to do some niche partitioning and alter their resource gathering, whether it be food, light, water, etc., so that there's some differentiation, so they're not directly competing in the same space, that they have developed some way of coexistence. And we'll look at a couple examples of that. The first one comes from a paramecium, and this is, let's walk through. So we've got caudatum. I practiced these earlier. I'm just terrible at names. Barsaria. It's probably Bursaria. I think that's caudatum. And Aurelia. So we've got caudatum alone, caudatum and Bursaria. So they do better alone than they do with a competitor. Bursaria alone and Bursaria with caudatum. So in both of these examples, they do better on their own than they do with a competitor. The population density is what we're measuring here on the y and time on the x. And then this is Aurelia with caudatum and caudatum with Aurelia. So, that's the same. Aurelia with caudatum, caudatum with Aurelia. 1 second. Oh, sorry, I got confused by that for a second. So this is the population of Aurelia here, and this is the population of caudatum here. So in this instance, they're able to form competitive coexistence. So they're better alone, but with another member, they're able to change. And in this case, what the paramecium is doing is it's changing from a bacterial food source, I believe, containing yeast and bacteria, where when growing alone, paramecium and caudatum and Bursaria each follow logistic growth curves reaching carrying capacity. When growing together, they have a slower growth rate, but they feed on different items. So when caudatum is present with Aurelia, it experienced local extinction. So in this example, when you've got two species together, they change. I believe the example was when they're alone, they'll feed on free-floating yeast and bacteria. When they're together, one species will switch to eating settled yeast, and so they're partitioning the resource to different areas. Where here, this is a competitive exclusion, effectively, where Aurelia is out-competing Caudatum, so they're feeding on the same source, and Aurelia is just better at it and out-competes it. So it depends on what that species mix is, whether or not they employ competitive exclusion, fighting for the same thing, winner take all, or competitive coexistence, where they're able to partition the food resource. One specializes on free-floating food, and the other one focuses on detritus or food at the bottom. So it's neither of their preferred sources, but they're able to allocate the food resources, and both survive at some lower level than they would if they were alone. Experiments on these and other species had led to the competitive exclusion principle. Two species that use a limited resource in the same way cannot coexist indefinitely. So if, like in the ants, if they're using the same resource, eventually one is going to wind up outcompeting the other, unless there's some sort of niche partitioning or resource partitioning in this case. So resource partitioning is when species using a limited resource in different ways are able to coexist. And so that could be changing the size of prey items, timing, things like that to get around. They're still resource limited, but they're not directly competing with one another. This is the study looking at cyanobacteria, where there's two different species. One absorbs green wavelengths most efficiently, and the other absorbs red wavelengths most efficiently. And each species can survive alone when grown in either wavelength. So the green species can survive under red light, and the red species can survive under green light, provided that they're alone. So they're not the most efficient. So the green adapted cyanobacteria are not the most efficient at absorbing red, but they can get enough to survive, and vice versa for the red. When they're grown under green light, in a lack of competition, they're still able to survive. And so we can look at that here when we start to compare them. So these are probably green and red. Yeah, they are. Okay. So grown in green light, the red. This is kind of funny. The red cyanobacteria, which absorbs green light, and the green cyanobacterium, which absorbs red light. Okay, let's make it more confusing. So here, the green absorbing cyanobacteria is competitively dominant compared to the red absorbing cyanobacteria, which is not competitively dominant under green light. But again, they can both survive when they're on their own, and the opposite is true for the red light. The green cyanobacterium, which absorbs red light, does well under red light. The red cyanobacterium, which absorbs green light, does not do well under competition for red light. Now, when they're both exposed to white light, which has a full spectrum, over time they kind of normalize them and are about the same population level. So under a certain suite of conditions, they'll be more dominant. And then the researcher went out and compared this to a bunch of different lakes, depending on the color of the lake and the trophic structure, to figure out which light is more common, either red light or green light. And in that instance found that in red light conditions, under natural red light conditions, the green cyanobacterium, which absorbs red light, is more abundant, and vice versa. One way to get around this green-red thing is they're absorbing red light, so they're not red because they've absorbed that light. They're reflecting the green light, is one way of thinking about it. So it's a bit backwards. So green cyanobacterium are green because they're not absorbing green, they're reflecting it back out. Red cyanobacteria are red because they're absorbing green light and reflecting red back out. So typically the color they are is the opposite of the color that they are absorbing. Character displacement occurs when two species compete for resources, and natural selection may favor phenotypes that allow them to partition their limiting resources, thus decreasing the intensity of competition. Meaning that when you have two species that generally have an overlapping diet, in this case we're using size of prey, and again, prey does not necessarily mean critters. It could mean seeds, nuts, whatever they're consuming. Remember, plants can be prey. So in this instance, they have a fair amount of overlap. And when they come together, through time, they begin to diverge and start to select on either smaller or larger prey. So rather than fighting over the middle here, they start to develop the non-overlapping sections of their prey distribution. So through time, they move further to the left or the right, depending on what part of their prey partition is that they're not in direct competition for. So this middle part, they're in direct competition for, so species 2 will develop, in this case, the ability to consume larger prey or select for individuals that can consume larger prey. And species 1 will start to select for individuals that can consume smaller prey because they're not in direct competition. And we can see this, of course, we got to look at Darwin's finches here in the Galapagos to see what happens. And so when these two species are together, they've developed, they've selected for different sizes of beaks. Again, a smaller beak and a larger beak. When they're found on an island without the competing species, their beak sizes tend to overlap quite a bit. Slightly larger distribution here for Fortis and a slightly smaller distribution for Fulgi Genosoa, terrible. So you can kind of look at this like this here. So when there's a pretty big overlap between their beak sizes, and then looking at the island where they both exist, that's a analog for time. So in geology, we often use space for time, and same thing for evolutionary history, which is why we tend to look at islands. And so, on an island where they've both been together for quite a long time, their beak size starts to switch, which is an indication of the sort of seeds and nuts and prey that they're consuming. And so that's a measure of prey, that the beak is, beaks are selected for the type of prey that they're consuming. So we've got a big difference here. And then when just one species is on an island, there's a huge overlap between their beak sizes. So that's starting to drive this character displacement by moving them to extremes. The experimental studies of stickleback fish, spadefoot toad tadpoles, E. coli have supported these observational studies. Results suggest that competition caused observed morphological differences. Character displacement occurred, and the species are better able to partition their resources as a result. So through competition, individuals, there's a big selection pressure for individuals that are effectively outside of that competition. So if we think about it here, if you're focused on this space as either species 1 or species 2, there's a lot of competition, where here there's little competition, and so you're going to have disproportionately more fitness, better access to food, presumably better young, and that's going to lead to a selection pressure and drive those two distributions apart from one another. So let's just a quick bit on this one, and we'll come back to everybody's favorite equation, the Lacca-Volterra model, with a modification around competition.